Okay, let's start it. Vamos retomar, então, no 9º Colóquio Internacional Schopenhauer, entrando agora ao vivo no YouTube. Teremos a conferência da professora Sandra Shapshay, de Nova York. O Guilherme vai fazer a apresentação dela para nós. Please, Guilherme.
So it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Sandra Shapshay. She obtained her PhD in the Department of Philosophy of Columbia University. She's professor at the Hunter College and the Graduate Center located in New York City. She has several works in the fields of aesthetics, ethics, and classical German philosophy, like the book Reconstruction Schopenhauer Ethics, Hope, Compassion, and Animal Welfare, and the book The Palgrave Schopenhauer Handbook. She's the president of Schopenhauer Gesellschaft in the US, and she will clarify us today the difference between aesthetics and moral perception. So please, Professor, be very welcome to our Congress, and we are very excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Vocês querem que eu fale em português? Sim? Bom, então, é um enorme prazer e honra introduzir aqui, apresentar a professora Sandra Shapshay. Ela fez o seu doutorado no Departamento de Filosofia da Columbia University, e ela é professora hoje, né, no Hunter College and the Graduate Center de Nova York. Né? Ela tem várias publicações nos campos de ética, estética e filosofia clássica alemã, como reconstruindo a ética do Schopenhauer, Hope, Compassion and Animal Welfare, né? E o livro The Palgrave Schopenhauer Handbook. Né? Ela é a presidente da Sociedade Schopenhauer nos Estados Unidos, e ela vai falar hoje sobre a diferença entre as percepções éticas e estéticas. Portanto, seja bem-vinda, professora. Estamos muito animados para escutá-la.
Muito obrigada. and my apologies for this presentation of English, but this is going to be the best presentation here. This is the best language for my presentation, for sure. Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers of this wonderful colloquium, the 9th International Schopenhauer Colloquium in Brazil. Thank you so much, Professor Cacciola, Professor Giacoia, Professor Brandao, Professor Ramos, and Professor Eduardo. And thank you all so much for coming out today to hear this talk. It's such a pleasure and honor to be invited to participate with you all. So my talk is titled Aesthetic and Moral Perception. And I'm actually more interested in moral perception, but I'm going to use aesthetic perception as a kind of important contrast, and you'll see why in a second. Let me see if I can advance the slide though. There we go. Okay. So aesthetic and moral perception both involve for Schopenhauer a metaphysical insight. And it's pretty clear in the case of aesthetic perception what that insight is. Schopenhauer tells us that it's insight into the ideas or through either aesthetic perception of nature or life or a work of art. And in the case of music, it's perception of the will itself insofar as we can obtain such perception. And so the metaphysical insight of aesthetic perception is quite clear, but it's less clear what it is in the case of moral perception in Schopenhauer's philosophy. So he gives us a couple of fairly clear statements about what that is. On the basis of morality, he writes that the compassionate person makes, quote, less of a distinction than everyone else between himself and others. Excuse me. And the compassionate insight consists in, quote, one individual's immediately recognizing himself, his own true essence, in the other. So the main questions of my presentation are, what is the metaphysics underlying Schopenhauer's ethics of compassion? Or otherwise put, what is the veridical metaphysical insight of the compassionate person for Schopenhauer? And the answer, I don't know how controversial this is going to be, maybe very controversial. I hope so. But the preview of my answer is not what most commentators have supposed. That is, the metaphysical insight of the compassionate person is not Schopenhauer's metaphysical monism of will. Okay, so, but I'll leave the punchline for what I think it is till later. Okay. So the traditional view of the content of compassion is captured pretty nicely, I think, by a philosopher by the name of Colin Marshall, who works out of University of Washington in the United States. And he writes that in his book, Compassionate Moral Realism, in which he takes Schopenhauer to be the sort of main precursor of his view, of his contemporary metaethical view. He writes that that compassion towards another being, as Schopenhauer understands it, is a person's, sorry, part of my screen is like kind of cut off here. There we go. Okay. Is a person's immediate recognition of a metaphysical fact, that she is not distinct from that other being, that not I. And in an article that he published last year called Schopenhauer on the Content of Compassion, he puts it even more pithily. He says, Schopenhauer seems to hold that compassion informs us about the truth of radical metaphysical monism. So let's call this the metaphysical monist view of the content of compassion. Okay. Let me see if I can advance the screen. Okay. Oops, I'll do it this way maybe. There we go. Okay, but I see that there are several problems with the monist, the metaphysical monist view. So first of all, Schopenhauer is quite clear that the compassionate person makes less of a distinction between self and others, but not no distinction at all, which is what you might think if the metaphysical insight at the heart of compassion is radical metaphysical monism. Why would the compassionate person make any distinction at all between the self and other? But Schopenhauer writes, again, on the basis of morality, he says, but if we go back to what is essential in such a character, that is the good character, we find it undeniably in his making less of a distinction than everyone else between himself and others. Dass weniger als die übrigen einen Unterschied zwischen sich und anderen macht. And this distinction, he goes on to say, is so great in the eyes of the malicious person. It is still so great in the eyes of an egoist. So some perception of personal distinction is always maintained by the compassionate person. And this comes out also extremely clearly when Schopenhauer is contrasting his view with that, his view of compassion with that of Ubaldo Cassina. He says, it remains clear and present to us at every single moment that he is the sufferer, not us. And it is precisely in his person, not in ours, that we feel the pain to our distress, etc. So it's difficult to square Schopenhauer's phenomenological description of the feeling of compassion, which always maintains a sense of some separateness of persons, with the notion that the metaphysical insight of compassion is into the completely unindividuated metaphysical will. So I've got an alternative interpretation that I worked out in my 2019 book, and that I'm shamelessly promoting here with this slide, which I call the axiological interpretation. And actually, this interpretation, I took a lot of inspiration from Chris Janaway, who suggested an axiological reading of the insight of compassion, actually in the first chapter of a book he wrote on Nietzsche, on Nietzsche's genealogy. But the first chapter is all about Schopenhauer's ethics. And there, Chris Janaway says he wants that he reads the compassionate person's insight as, quote, there's an essential parity of all beings who strive and suffer insofar as they share a common essence or inner nature. And Janaway suggests that the content of compassion may be understood axiologically, that is purely evaluatively, as follows. He writes, there is nothing of any fundamental importance about the individual that I am, such that from a universal moral standpoint, it is a matter of indifference whether my ends are promoted and the others thwarted or vice versa. Okay. So actually, I like the suggestion a lot, but I see also a problem with Janaway's version of the axiological interpretation, which is that perception that it's a matter of indifference whether my ends are promoted or the others are thwarted, doesn't really do justice to the motivatingness of the compassionate insight. So so my alternative is to sort of put a twist on the axiological interpretation and understand what the moral agent recognizes is that things matter to the other in the way they, sorry, this is still Janaway, but things matter to the other because the other matters. And that's, for me, the motivating thought here. So in other words, for Janaway, if the perception of the compassionate person is simply that, things happen to matter to the other in the same way they matter to me, it's not clear why I should care about the other. It's not clear why I should be motivated to prevent or alleviate the suffering of another. But that's precisely what Schopenhauer thinks is the phenomenon of compassion. The compassionate subject is motivated to prevent or alleviate the suffering of the other, sometimes to the extent of even sacrificing oneself for the sake of the other. And it's not clear to me how Janaway's version of this axiological interpretation could really be motivating, or even motivating at all, but certainly not highly motivating in terms of action. So my version of the interpretation is, which I work out in this book, is that I, the compassionate person, recognize intuitively that the other and I have roughly equal inherent value based on shared essence. So it's not that just things matter to the other in the way they matter to me, but the other just matters intrinsically, just as I matter. The other has positive inherent value, just as I do. And I have some quotes, and I try to argue at length for this interpretation in the book. And most of the quotes, though, I must admit that I found which seem to suggest that Schopenhauer really does have a view of intrinsic value or inherent value of beings who are capable of suffering. They tend to come out when Schopenhauer is talking about the horrible treatment of non-human animals in European, especially theological, Judeo-Christian, but also Kantian ethics. And so just a couple of quotes. He says, what are morals of pariahs which fail to recognize the eternal essence, das ewige Wesen, that is present in everything that has life and that shines out with unfathomable significance, unergründliche Bedeutsamkeit, from all eyes that see the light of the sun. And then he criticizes Judeo-Christian ethics and also Kantian ethics, says, but that form of morals recognizes and gives consideration solely to its own valuable species, die eigene Werte Species, whose distinguishing mark, reason, is for it the condition on which a being can be the object of moral consideration. But the purpose of this talk is actually not to kind of rehash this line of argument in the book, but rather to adduce another argument that in favor of my axiological interpretation. And it's based on the asymmetry between moral and aesthetic perception. So I've got this still life over here by Chardin. It's just a sort of handy example. So of aesthetic perception. Hopefully this fantastic still life is going to just draw us into some aesthetic perception, especially of that water glass, I think, which is really quite striking. So what I want to say is that for Schopenhauer, both the aesthetic and moral perception involve a metaphysical insight, right? And so, for example, Schopenhauer thinks of a still life like this one from Chardin is going to invite us into a kind of will-less contemplation of the water glass, the garlic heads, the jug of water, as opposed to our ordinary experience with the water glass, obviously, which is interested typically, and we just ready to hand, and we never really contemplate a water glass that is in heavy use, in our normal lives. But in the context of the still life, the water glass, we perceive, for Schopenhauer, in perceiving the still life, kind of the essences of things. If looking at the glass of water, for example, the essence of water and the importance of water, say, in the context of a human life. In this very ordinary context, we are somehow drawn in now to intuitively understand the essential nature of water in its stillness, and also the meaning of water in our human lives. But the key for Schopenhauer for aesthetic perception is clearly the subject's attitude needs to be will-less. So there are two necessary ingredients for aesthetic perception. Schopenhauer says the cognition of an object as a Platonic idea, or in the case of music, the cognition of will, as close as we can get to it, and the necessary condition for the perception of ideas and will in music is the subject needs to be the pure will-less subject of cognition, als rein willenlosen Subjekt der Erkenntnis. So the part that I need to underscore here is that will-lessness is a necessary condition for aesthetic perception of ideas and will. But crucially, moral perception is not will-less, right? Whereas the aesthetic perceiver perceives the world as a knower, not as a sufferer, the moral perceiver perceives the world as a co-sufferer. So even though the moral perceiver, the compassionate person, perceives things non-egoistically, she still is willful insofar as she suffers along with the other. And so I don't know if you all can see I'm just going to move. Can you see the full diagram there? So I've left so basically the argument is if the subject's attitude of will-lessness is clearly missing in the case of moral perception, it seems like it cannot be the case that the metaphysical insight of moral perception is the same as aesthetic perception. And in the case of music, the content of that aesthetic perception is supposed to be will. So it seems right off the bat that the object of moral perception cannot be the metaphysical will, because it lacks a necessary condition for such, namely will-lessness. Okay, so I fill in the question marks then with my interpretation, which is that the I and the other both share inherent value. But there's something crucially missing from my schema there, which is that what happened to the metaphysical part of the moral insight? If the full content of moral perception is simply that the other and the I both share inherent value, what happened to the metaphysics of this shared essence and the perception of shared essence? And so otherwise put, you could say, why should this count as a veridical metaphysical insight? what Schopenhauer clearly thinks it is in the compassionate person's experience. And in other words, what connects the perception of the other as inherently valuable with the perception of the I and the other as having shared essence. So, so I think there is a bridge between the notion of shared essence in compassionate experience and shared value. And Schopenhauer implicitly builds this bridge in the final section of On the Basis of Morality, where he enumerates what he calls the many ancient and modern systems which have held that, quote, all plurality is only apparent, and that it is only one and the same truly existing essence that really manifests itself present and identical in all. And Schopenhauer has a really long list here of all the different systems that have, in religious and philosophical systems that have signed on to this basic thought. He says, it is the chief and fundamental doctrine of the sacred Vedas. The wisdom of Pythagoras was likewise based on it. The Neoplatonists were permeated by it, in that they taught that because of the unity of all things, all souls are one. And among the Mohammedans, we find it again as the inspired mysticism of the Sufis. This is my best clue. Spinoza's name is identified with it. What is Spinoza's name identified with? And even the Christian mystics become entangled in it against their will and intent. So I think, in a word, the bridge here between shared essence and shared value, and the perception of the one shared essence in all things at the heart of compassionate insight, is pantheism. Okay, now this might be controversial. I think it will be, but I really think this is right, because it seems that pantheism fits the bill in all ways. It kind of connects both the seeing past the principium individuationis to the one shared essence, obviously. But because pantheism sees that essence as divine, not as morally indifferent, or worse, morally bad, not as a morally bad metaphysical will, for example. And because the divine is conceptually conceived as synonymous with the good, the pantheistic insight that I think is at the basis of compassion for Schopenhauer bridges shared essence on the one hand, shared one single essence, with inherent goodness. So it bridges both the kind of metaphysical monism and the perception of the other as valuable, because that shared essence in a pantheistic insight is divine. Okay, so here's my first conclusion, first pass. The metaphysical insight of moral perception is the perception of the other as is inherently valuable, based on a shared one divine essence. Okay. Another thing, I think, if the pantheistic insight really is the bridge between the perception of shared value and the perception of shared essence, it actually makes sense of another asymmetry between aesthetic and moral perception. So for Schopenhauer, moral perception and the actions motivated by it are ultimately quite mysterious for Schopenhauer. Accordingly, he writes that, he says, every wholly pure good deed is really a mysterious action, a practical mysticism, and is truly explicable in no other manner. And in Parerga and Paralipomena, too, he writes, every completely disinterested good deed is a mysterious act, a mysterium. And I'm actually really indebted to my friend Andrew Weeks, who's here in the audience, whose work got me to see actually just how full of mysticism Schopenhauer's moral, his ethics of compassion really is. I think I had always kind of ignored it or hoped it wasn't there, but I think it's very pronounced how he ultimately thinks he says, that that every pure good deed is explicable in no other manner than as a practical mysticism. And this is quite an asymmetry with aesthetic perception, because Schopenhauer says, when he introduces aesthetic perception in book 3 of the first volume, he says that his account may produce some astonishment, befremdennis, in the reader, but that it will dissipate, he says, once the reader has grasped the complete thought being communicated in this work. So, you're going to be kind of surprised by his account of aesthetic experience, but it's not that mysterious. However, moral perception will never be clarified. He says it's fundamentally a mystery. It's a mysterious action, a practical mysticism. It's not going to be clarified by philosophy ever. So, but I think many people will sort of have an immediately negative reaction to this thesis, because doesn't Schopenhauer famously trash the view of pantheism as a theoretical view? And absolutely, he does. In the Paralipomena, he says first that pantheism is a view that it's basically theism that then takes the view of God as all-knowing and all-powerful and just makes that view of God become the world, right? And he thinks it's absurd that an all-powerful and all-wise God should become a world containing so much evil. So we have, just at the outset, it seems like Sandra, you can't be right? Because on the one hand, pantheism is clearly a false view, but how could it be how could the pantheistic insight that the one shared essence of the world is actually divine, how could that be, that perception be veridical in compassionate experience and totally false from a theoretical standpoint? But I think for Schopenhauer, it doesn't matter that there is a huge contradiction here, because recall what he says about the essence of morality. It's a practical mysticism. And in his manuscripts, he defines mysticism as, quote, the free expression of direct metaphysical knowledge with a contempt for all the very strong objections of the faculty of reason. Now, clearly, all of Schopenhauer's arguments against pantheism as a theoretical view constitute very strong objections of the faculty of reason. But mystical knowledge doesn't have to care about that, right? Because it may be in stark contradiction to the very strong objections of the faculty of reason by the lights of the way Schopenhauer understands mysticism. So that's my best quote there from the manuscripts about how mysticism can actually really embrace a real contradiction with the dictates of reason. But it's from the manuscript. So the best I've got from his published works is that he calls mysticism, he says, quote, in the broadest sense, is any instruction leading toward direct awareness of what is unreachable by either intuition or concept, and hence what cannot be reached by any cognition at all. So he's a little less clear on how mystical insight can actually run extremely counter to the dictates of reason, but still it seems that they occupy, in that quote, they occupy different spheres of cognition entirely. So, so Schopenhauer says, accordingly, where his own teaching reaches its highest point, it thus ends with a negation, but this is precisely where the mystic proceeds positively. Okay, so here's my conclusion. Second pass is that the content of moral perception is ultimately mystical. And so theoretically speaking, in Schopenhauer's philosophy, the real substratum is will, and it is absolutely not divine, but perceived willfully through compassionate eyes, this shared essence is indeed veridically recognized as divine and endows all others with inherent value. So in this way, moral perception in Schopenhauer's thought, unlike aesthetic perception, is inextricably bound up with mysticism, but it is not any worse epistemically for that. And in fact, there are places, and if we want to talk about this in the discussion, there's some pretty nice quotes toward the end of On the Basis of Morality too, where Schopenhauer suggests that the compassionate person is actually epistemically in a better position than the scholar or the philosopher, if the scholar or the scholar, the philosopher, the genius, if they don't in their heart of hearts embrace the perception at the heart of compassion. So I think he suggests highly that if it were a contest between theoretical perception and moral perception of the metaphysical substratum, it's the moral perceiver who actually should get the epistemic nod. Okay, so back to the main questions that I started off with then. So what is the metaphysics underlying Schopenhauer's ethics of compassion? I think the answer is pantheism. Pantheism as a practical mysticism. Otherwise put, so what is the veridical metaphysical insight of the compassionate person for Schopenhauer? I think the answer is, it is the perception of the other as inherently valuable based on a shared single divine essence. And that's it. So I really welcome discussion, and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for this brilliant conference. We would like to invite you to answer a couple of questions now. We are very open here to anyone who wants to answer.
I would have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry to have to speak as a disembodied voice from the void here, but first of all, I'd like to thank Sandra. I find this approach to Schopenhauer very revealing, and in particular, I think that it opens up new paths for research, and I appreciate the breaking down of this overly dichotomous distinction between willful and will-less. I think that that's a kind of imposition on Schopenhauer's thought, which prevents us from entertaining certain questions. The idea of bringing aesthetic perception into it, I think, is very, very productive. It appeals to me intuitively for a particular reason. I used to be a deer hunter. I'm a reformed deer hunter who gave it up. And I can say that the passions of a hunter are really pretty much the same passions of a beast, of an animal. It's a matter of stalking and catching or killing and eventually eating your prey. But the bird watcher is actually also a hunter. And yet the bird watcher only wants to see this unique creature, this unique species. The bird watcher doesn't kill the bird, doesn't capture the bird. In every other regard, the bird watcher is very much a willful hunter. But the difference is that the response of the bird watcher is essentially aesthetic. I think that other people have thought of that before me, and particularly I'm impressed by Leo Tolstoy. If you happen to have read The Cossacks, there's a wonderful scene in which the deer hunter Olenin has a kind of mystical experience in which he realizes that he's one with all living creatures and that he's one with the deer. I think Tolstoy took this seriously because the name Olenin is actually derived from the Russian word for deer. So I think this is something that's been thought of before by creative writers. So I think it's a very interesting direction to go, and I would encourage continuing along this line. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I actually, in some ways, those are very nice, different kinds of ways of perceiving, the deer hunter. I would put the deer hunter kind of in the I guess, in the egoistic camp. So perceives the deer willfully as an item to potentially be eaten. The bird watcher, it's true, takes a kind of purely aesthetic stance on the bird, and actually I think the compassionate person would then take another stance, which is because I think because the compassionate person would look, say, let's say a bird with a broken wing or something, looks upon the bird as a co-sufferer rather than as just a mere knower. So, but I think I like those the three kinds of attitudes come out really clearly, I think, in those kinds of concrete cases.
Vocês querem que eu tente traduzir o principal? Eu vou tentar traduzir aqui, então, resumindo um pouco. Ele fez uma comparação, né, sobre o birdwatching, né, que é contemplar os pássaros, né, e o caçador, né, dos pássaros, que realmente são atitudes muito diferentes, né, e a professora, ela realmente falou que o caçador, ele é egoísta, né, ele tenta se aproximar de um jeito, né, bastante predatório, e o observador, ele pega o caminho da contemplação, que tem semelhanças com aquele que é ético, né, com a pessoa que tem experiência ética, mas também tem diferenças, né, que quem tem o viés mais ético também vai fazer algo a mais que o observador não faz, né, por exemplo, cuidar do pássaro, se importar com a dor dele, né, então nós temos aqui três atitudes bem diferentes, né, o do egoísta, caçador, né, o do contemplador estético, né, e a pessoa que pratica a experiência ética, né, o compassivo, que vai tentar, né, ajudar diretamente o pássaro. Bem em resumo, foi mais ou menos isso, tá?
Should I call on next folks? I think I see Alex has a question. Alexander?
Jamie, Dax.
Oh, Dax, yes, right.
First of all, congrats, Professor.
Thank you.
I think I agree to the core for a very good presentation. I have some problem just with the word value. What could we name value? Well, Schopenhauer denies any a priori value for human species or even any value in life. Would value mean some kind of interest in another one's good, for example?
Yes, thank you, Dax. I mean, I think that's the main line of pushback that I have received on my book. That's because because it's hard to find a concept of inherent value in Schopenhauer. You're right that there are places where Schopenhauer suggests that the only kind of value there is instrumental value. You know, something's good for for some other purpose, and nothing's good in itself. And so in the book I've tried hard to kind of excavate passages where he seems to rely on a notion of inherent value. In some ways, the only thing that makes sense of the passage, in my view, is that that beings have certain intrinsic value in themselves. So the passages that actually most support that are certainly when he talks about the treatment of non-human animals. And in that passage where he says, that like Kantian ethics, for example, only sees its own species as valuable and doesn't extend that. And his criticism of Kant there and European theological ethics is that they don't extend that notion of inherent value to other species. And so that's a place in his thought where I see that there is a notion of inherent value at work in his philosophy, even though there are other passages, you're absolutely right, to point to where he seems to suggest that all value is only instrumental. And then one other thing, a lot of folks also point to his criticisms of Kant on the basis of morality, his criticisms of the notion of absolute value, the value that the dignity of the human being beyond all price in Kant. And Schopenhauer says that doesn't make any sense. Absolute value, right? Every value is relative or comparative. But I actually don't think that not having absolute value, or sort of saying that that's absurd, is incompatible with anything having inherent value. Because, for example, it could be that that human beings have value in themselves and non-human animals have value in them in themselves, without it being the kind of value that Kant talks about as trumping all other considerations. So, for example, Schopenhauer's fine with these very compassionate folks who sacrifice themselves for the sake of others, right? Kant would actually, I guess you could say that would be pretty controversial for a Kantian, because you may not, treat even the humanity in yourself as a mere means, and only but always as an end in itself. But I think so for Schopenhauer, he doesn't hold on to any kind of notion of absolute value that trumps any other sort of consideration. But I think he does hold on to a notion of inherent value. But the positive case for that, I try to make in the book, but I think in some ways it's hard to convince folks of that case, and that's why in part I'm trying to get at the same place from another angle in this paper through the contrast between aesthetic and moral perception.
Thank you. Perhaps in metaphysical terms, we simply don't have yet a word for naming that.
I think he says Wert. He talks about the Werte species. I think that kind of, he does use that word of Werte. I think we could see him as applying that more broadly than is typically seen in his thought.
I see. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Será que você poderia traduzir para a gente, Dax, a sua pergunta?
Esse trabalho é seu, né, Guilherme?
Mas você tá mais por dentro.
Não, então, vou traduzir tudo, é impossível, né? Passo a passo, mas a minha pergunta foi sobre... eu concordo, né, com o caminho, né, que Shapshay toma, mas inclusive com relação à inerência. Mas a palavra valor foi o que eu questionei, como se enquadraria aí, porque Schopenhauer nega, como constava na resposta dela, a recusa de um valor da vida, um valor da espécie, uma dignidade humana, todos esses princípios abstratos, esses valores relativos, e o caráter sempre utilitário, né, do valor, né, sempre o valor para alguma coisa. Mas, inclusive, como ela disse no final, né, partindo de raras expressões como o valor da espécie, né, Werte species, se poderia puxar isso com uma outra compreensão de um valor que não é um valor absoluto, mas que poderia nomear, né, essa relação em nome de que, né, a compaixão. Tem também um elemento, ela pontuou repetidas vezes que esse foi um dos pontos mais visados, né, no trabalho dela, na crítica, que exigiu mais, né, de elaborar no texto de uma maneira plausível, né? Ela reconhece as dificuldades, enfim. Acho que é isso.
Perfeito, muito obrigado. Abbiamo adesso una domanda dalla Bella Italia, per favore, Alessandro Novembre. Alessandro, está parlando? Noi non sentiamo.
Yes, thank you. I will try to ask the questions in English, even though my English is so-so. Thank you very much for this interesting paper. I have a lot of questions also because your paper touched very closely on some of the themes of my paper, which I will give next Tuesday. I'll just ask one and try to be as concise as possible. My idea is that there is a metaphysical foundation of Schopenhauer's ethics, namely a metaphysical foundation of the inherent value of beings, and that this foundation consists not in pantheism. This would imply Schopenhauer's inconsistency, but in the redeemability of beings, also in the fact that beings can be redeemed. The will to live is evil, and the world is evil, but nevertheless, everything that exists could be brought back out of existence. It could be redeemed and brought back into nothingness, as, for example, the Buddha did, or as the mystics try to do. The passion of Jesus could also be understood in this sense. I would like to know what you think of this hypothesis of mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. That's super interesting. I think that's a really interesting suggestion. That, so if I understand you correctly, you'd say that you're kind of with me that there is a kind of sense of inherent value at work in Schopenhauer's ethics, but the value of all beings would inhere in their potential for being redeemed. Exactly. And the potential for being redeemed would be that they can be, I guess this is the hard part to grasp. Yes, that they can be redeemed in nothingness.
Yes.
Okay, so so I think that's I guess that is that seems to go pretty well with the resignationism in the resignationist strand of Schopenhauer's thought. But I think for me that wouldn't do a lot of work in motivating compassionate action for a couple of reasons. So first of all, Schopenhauer says that human beings can attain redemption by negation of the will, but that wouldn't work at all for non-human animals. But Schopenhauer is very clear that we should feel a lot of compassion for non-human animals. So if non-human animals can't actually redeem themselves, and it's not clear how they would
redeemed.
If they can be redeemed. Okay, so maybe their worth would inhere in their ability to be redeemed, say, by human beings who can negate the will into nothingness. Okay, so well, then I think one other problem I think I'd have with that view is that it's not clear that if that were the insight of compassion, why it should motivate an activity to prevent the woe or to promote the well-being of another. Because in some ways, if the only ultimate good to be had is nothingness, then what's the point of trying to reduce all this local suffering? But the point of compassion is centrally to reduce the amount of suffering. So I guess I like my story better because it goes well, I think, with the motivation to actually to help the welfare.
Nothingness of pain, nothingness of being is nothingness of pain.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the value is the nothingness of pain.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually, it's a view. Chris Janaway and I have had this back and forth. He's more partial to your view for sure. Chris is definitely in your camp. But I find that if the ultimate value resides in nothingness, it just doesn't make sense of, compassion as a phenomenon. You know, it makes sense of resignation, but it does not make sense of compassion. I think but we should have this,
Thank you very much.
We should definitely talk more about this. And I look forward to your talk.
Danke.
Bom, eu vou tentar traduzir e resumir. Tivemos uma conversa excelente aqui entre o Alessandro e a Sandra. Né? O Alessandro pontuou, né, que de fato ele acredita que existe uma fundação, né, metafísica para a questão de que há valores, né, no mundo, né? Mas essa fundação, ele acredita que não vai tanto pelo caminho do panteísmo, né? Vai mais pela capacidade de se redimir, né? Portanto, pelo caminho da autonegação da vontade, né? E a Sandra, ela replicou dizendo que essa parte da negação da vontade é uma parte muito difícil, né? Porque se redimir é se tornar nada, né? Portanto, é uma coisa, né, que realmente fica uma dúvida muito grande. E ela defende uma outra posição. Ela falou que o Janaway concorda mais com o Alessandro, né? Mas ela defende que no fato da compaixão, não dá para pegar, né, o conceito da autonegação da vontade, né? De se redimir completamente como critério para fundamentar e esclarecer a compaixão, né? Porque a compaixão, ela é um fenômeno, né? Ela falou da ética animal, por exemplo, né? Como que a gente vai ajudar um animal se o animal ele não é capaz, né, de ser redimido, né? Ele não é capaz de autonegação da vontade, ele não é capaz de fazer isso por si só. O Alessandro devolveu falando que ele pode ser redimido pelo homem, né? Ou seja, estamos entrando aqui num nível bem avançado da discussão. E, enfim, ela acredita que na compaixão há um fator motivacional, né, um fator fenomênico, né, que faz com que ela não seja exatamente a autonegação, né? E por isso que ela relaciona a compaixão com o willful, né? Com a vontade cheia, né? Não é o will-less, né? Não é a falta de vontade como acontece na contemplação estética, né? Mas é um momento em que a vontade ela atua ainda, né? Então ela prefere o panteísmo como fundação, tá? Bom, temos the next question would be of Alexander.
Desculpe, é que desculpe interromper, é que teve um elemento importante, eu acho, na resposta no finalzinho, e uma pergunta que eu acho muito intrigante. Haveria sentido na compaixão, né, se fosse apenas remissão, porque a resignação é cair no nada, né? Então, isso poderia responder ao problema, né, da redenção, enfim, mas não a questão da compaixão.
Você está traduzindo uma parte da resposta dela?
Sim.
Ah, tá.
Só
muito
para
obrigado.
destacar um ponto que eu achei.
Não, foram muitas coisas que foram ditas, realmente não dá, mas muito obrigado. Okay, next question would be of Alexander. So, please, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sandy, for your illuminating and brilliant talk. I'm very much on board with much of what you have said, especially given that the very idea of an inherent value is very much in accord with what I myself reconstructed the day before yesterday, which is no surprise to you, of course. I have one quick question, though, and one objection, which actually goes in the same direction as the question of Dax and Alessandro, so I'll be quick. The quick question is there any particular reason why you chose the word perception for the cognition, for the type of cognition you're talking about? Because within the Kantian paradigm, this suggests somehow the raw kind of cognition, right, where only sensibility is at work, whereas Schopenhauer clearly means here cognition. And the objection can be summarized very briefly in one further question, namely, if the inherent value is not absolute, where is its inherentness, so to speak? Where does it come from, right? If it is not so much instrumental, if it's not conventional, but rather intrinsic, as you said. And just one very quick commentary about Spinoza. I don't think that if you take Spinoza as an example, that you can actually refer to the deity, because the deity or God is an alias, as it were, and the proper name for this enkaipan, one and all, is substance, not God.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you, Alexander. I think the reason I use both perception, for aesthetic and moral perception, is because I'm trying to sort of talk about intuitive erkenntnis in both cases. I think what I wanted to stress is that it's not highly conceptual, the kind of insight that is at work in both aesthetic and moral perception, so that Schopenhauer says that for the compassionate person need not have any kind of, need not be able to conceptually articulate the insight that that he or she has, and can be a very sort of uneducated person and still has this intuitive erkenntnis. So that's what why I was going with the word perception. Although I think cognition would maybe be just as good. It's maybe it sounds a little weird. So like aesthetic cognition, moral cognition, but honestly, I think I could use them interchangeably with perception. It might be that in Anglo-American debates about moral, kind of intuitive moral knowledge, it tends to be talked about in terms of moral perception. I think that's part of the reason why I chose that term. The other question about inherentness, where does it come from? And that's, I think, exactly why I think the pantheism is needed as the kind of metaphysical basis, because inherent value is very mysterious, right? Why would anything have inherent or intrinsic value? I mean, this is a, it's a big problem, I think, in Kant as well. He, in Kantian ethics, at least if you read Kant in a very realist way, Kant just posits it as, as a starting point for his ethics, that, that rational nature has value in itself, dignity beyond all price, right? So that's, I think, this kind of mysterious starting point in Kant's ethics. And I think in some ways for Schopenhauer, the way I understand it is that the compassionate person perceives this value, so or cognizes this value intuitively. So in some ways, the feeling of compassion sort of tracks that inherent value. But where does it ultimately come from? I think the answer to that is it's a kind of mystical source that is ultimately explained by a practical mysticism that sees the world as divine. And so in that list, I mean, you might object, okay, we can't pin all that on just Spinoza, but the list that he gives at the end of on the basis of morality has a lot of theological thinkers in it as well. The Sufis, I guess Pythagoras, you maybe argue that there's a kind of theological undercurrent there. The Christians who get embroiled in it, all that whole list of sort of seemingly pantheistic thinkers. I I think the main flavor of that kind of pantheism, and I think what's grounding the inherentness of the value is this conceptual connection between the one essence and that one essence being seen as divine.
I guess my trouble is that while he obviously connects, yes, the one of himself and the one of all those thinkers, those thinkers do not have an evil principle beyond nature in their theories, and Schopenhauer does. So they have no trouble saying that the inherent value of myself is just a projection or a manifestation of the inherent value of the universe, but Schopenhauer would be having much trouble to explain why the inherent good value comes from the source of all evil.
And that, no, I think that's a great follow-up, because ultimately, I think if you buy the line of my presentation, it leaves us with a kind of contradiction in Schopenhauer's thought, which is, on the one hand, you know, the best we could say about what the world really is, theoretically speaking, it's this kind of at least amoral, but kind of seemingly kind of immoral will, metaphysical will. But on the other hand, from the standpoint of compassion, the compassionate person looks upon all the others as, in some ways, manifestations of the divine, and thus having inherent goodness in them. So I think it's it leaves a problem for sure that may or may not be resolvable.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bom, muitíssimo obrigado. Tivemos uma outra discussão super inflamada aqui, né? O Alexander perguntou por que a Sandra escolheu a palavra percepção, né, para falar da contemplação estética, né, e da moralidade. E, né, ele pontuou que essa palavra percepção, lá no Kant, tem um significado que não seria tão adequado aqui, né, uma coisa, né, enfim, que é muito corporal, etc. Perguntou também de onde que vem essa ideia do Schopenhauer de que o mundo tem valor em si mesmo, né, de que há uma dignidade ali no ser humano, né. E ele relativizou a questão do Spinoza, né, de que o Spinoza ele não pode ser exatamente chamado de panteísta, porque é uma substância, né, ele estaria um pouco fora dessa tradição. E a Sandra, ela falou que ela enfatizou a palavra percepção, né, quase que como uma provocação mesmo, né, quase que assim, para destacar mesmo o fator intuitivo, né, da experiência estética e ética. Né, não é uma intuição intelectual, nada disso, é uma coisa realmente intuitivo, né, então, portanto, percepção deixa bem claro essa ideia, né, e cognição, né, cognição ela também falou que seria uma palavra mais estranha, né, é conhecimento, estético, ético, ela gosta de percepção porque é uma coisa, né, bem viva, bem corporal, né. Ela, de onde que vem o valor em si mesmo da existência, a dignidade, né, ela falou que o Kant parte desse ponto de vista como seres racionais, né, o ser humano ele já tem uma dignidade ali, né, mas o Schopenhauer vai para uma fonte mais mística, como ela falou, né, que é a fonte de você ver o mundo como algo divino, né, como ela respondeu, né. Em última instância, há um único mundo e esse mundo ele é uma espécie, né, de Deus mesmo, né. Bom, e aí ela retomou o Spinoza dizendo que apesar de haver muitas diferenças entre os panteístas, né, o mais importante é, né, que todos eles defendem que há uma única essência, né, e ela é divina. Bom, o Alexandre devolveu uma pergunta, né, muito forte, realmente, que essa essência no homem, desculpa, que essa essência para o Schopenhauer, ela é má, né, ela seria mais um demônio, né, então como que, né, que uma essência má vai fundamentar, né, uma dignidade, né, e a Sandra, ela falou que, levando as últimas consequências, pode-se até apontar uma espécie de contradição, né, que há, não exatamente na filosofia do Schopenhauer, mas no próprio mundo, né, porque o mundo ele se apresenta como algo realmente imoral, né, ele é a terra da imoralidade, mas, por outro lado, né, há compaixão, né? Então, o mundo ele também pode ser visto como uma divindade, né? E por meio da compaixão a gente pode, enfim, acreditar, né, numa existência que não é, enfim, tão desprezível assim, talvez. Né? Okay, next question would be of Daniel.
Yes, me. Hi, Professor.
Hey. Hi, Daniel.
It's a pleasure. How are you? Well, I would like to propose a question. I don't know if you predict, but when you talk about divine essence or a godly existence or something like that in the practical mysticism of Schopenhauer, would you think that this divine would be more closer to an Hindu interpretation, which would maybe guide us to a reading which maybe Paul Deussen had done after, because in Hinduism, in Vedanta, we can assume, for example, some kind of polytheism under the umbrella of a monistic vision, because when the one manifests itself, it maybe could be understood as a polytheism. Well, or it would be closer to a Christian view of this divine, this concept of divine, which would maybe track us back to his early manuscripts when he talked about some kind of evil god, and which would work metaphysically to do harm to us and something like that. Would you think that to which direction this divine concept would go in this case? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, and I think it's certainly in his long list of systems of thought that have signed on to this one shared essence view. Certainly, he lists he lists the let's see, let me find his exact words here. I might not be able to find it. Oh darn! Well, he lists the Vedas as a source, and there's a great quote that comes at the very end, really like it's in the finale section of On the Basis of Morality. He says, he quotes from the Bhagavad Gita. He says, "He who sees that the highest Lord is the same in all living things and does not perish among those that perish, he sees the truth. And he who sees that same Lord present everywhere will not harm himself by his own fault. Then he makes his way to the highest path." So certainly, I mean, the Indian influence seems to be very strong, and he closes with it On the Basis of Morality. But I tend to think that in some ways, it would be hard to determine, I guess, whether the flavor of the divinity in this pantheistic thought is either Christian or Hindu, or maybe more Spinozist. I think he's kind of he's looking for something extremely general and trying to identify something mystical here as practical mysticism that kind of covers it all. I know that I think Chris Janaway's got a talk coming up soon where he questions, he takes up exactly your question, to what extent is Indian thought, is Schopenhauer's ethics Indian? And so I think he's got a pretty complicated answer to that question. But I guess what I would want to say is, in some ways, it's something more generic. I think ultimately the only thing he really needs in his ethics to connect, the compassionate concern for the well-being and woe of the other with this one shared essence idea, is some kind of conceptual connection between that one essence and it being good. And that, I think that's in some ways all that we need to get this thing off the ground.
Thank you very much. Será que você poderia me ajudar, Daniel, a traduzir a sua pergunta e a resposta dela?
Bom, basicamente ela falou, né, que até estava tendo uma conferência com o Christopher Janoway sobre essa questão de se a ética schopenhaueriana era mais hindu e tal, mas ela, assim, basicamente resumindo, né, ela considera que não acha bem assim, que esse misticismo do Schopenhauer é um misticismo que é mais generalista, né, um misticismo que ele tenta abarcar diversas tradições, ele não foca em um específico. Então, foi mais ou menos isso que eu entendi, o principal. Tem alguma coisa que eu perdi?
Acho que está perfeito. Muito obrigado. Flamarion, a gente não está escutando você.
Agora sim?
Sim.
Desculpe. Faltou o Daniel traduzir a pergunta dele. Ele traduziu a resposta, mas não a pergunta.
Gente, puxa, me desculpa. É porque eu perguntei para a professora se, quando ela fala em uma essência divina, né, dentro dessa noção que ela está propondo de misticismo prático, esse conceito de divino que ela estaria falando estaria talvez mais próximo de um divino hindu ou de um divino cristão, porque um divino hindu talvez até faria sentido também, porque se você for pensar do ponto de vista do Vedanta, por exemplo, né, ele, que é o que Schopenhauer lê e se interessa, ele consegue manter embaixo do guarda-chuva, né, foi a expressão que eu usei, do monismo, uma espécie de panteísmo que seria o uno manifesto. Quando o uno se manifesta, existe, né, uma concepção de Brahman sem qualidades e Brahman com qualidades. Então, basicamente isso, e também é uma visão que até eu acho o Paul Deussen, que é o autor que eu até apresentei ontem, desenvolve, ele usa esse termo divino, de essência divina, esse tipo de termo. Então, eu perguntei isso. Ou seria uma visão de divino mais próxima do cristianismo, o que acabaria levando a gente a traçar esse pensamento no manuscrito de juventude dele, que lá atrás, quando era bem novo, ele falava de um Deus maligno, de um possível Deus maligno. E é isso. Aí eu perguntei para ela qual seria, talvez, essa orientação divina dela.
Tá, muito obrigado. So we will have two last questions, if you don't mind. One of Rafael, another from Thomas. So please, Rafael.
Briefly, please.
Yes. Almost everything has been discussed, so yeah, I will cut this short. Well, thanks, Sandra, a lot for this beautiful talk. I also would touch upon something that Alex said, namely the term of pantheism. Well, as Schopenhauer understood it, it was still a substantial term, and Schopenhauer, as an eminent metaphysician, would have his problems with something which is a substance, which is only, which can only be grasped conceptually, and conceptual knowledge for Schopenhauer does not constitute metaphysical knowledge. He would have thought a transcendent substance is a metaphysically empty term. So what ontological status would your definition of pantheism be, and exactly what kind of pantheism would you choose? And already, as Alex has said, there is the Henkai Pan, there's the negative theology with the Neoplatonists or the Neoplatonics, and there is a more positive term with Spinoza. So which one would it be, and how would you combine it with Schopenhauer's critical metaphysics or critical epistemology?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll try to be super brief because I know we have to move on as well. But yeah, thank you. I think what I want to say about the pantheistic insight that I think is the metaphysical sort of basis of the experience of compassion is that the compassionate person's insight is not highly conceptualized. It's not worked out theoretically. I think the closest thing that comes to sort of identifying what it is, even though it can probably hardly be identified insofar as its practical mysticism, is basically that to see the one shared essence of the world as in some ways divine, meaning in some ways inherently good. And that, I think, is pretty much all the content that I think one could ascribe to this moral perception a la Schopenhauer. So certainly the compassionate person need not be a philosopher, need not have studied anything about the history of philosophy, etc. But insofar as the compassionate person sees the one shared essence as good, and in that way, I think that counts as sort of pantheistic for Schopenhauer's ethical view.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Rafael, could you please translate your question and answer? You speak a very well Portuguese.
Sure. Primeiro, eu perguntava o que é a noção do panteísmo que tem nela, porque tem várias noções, como o panteísmo do Platão ou do neoplatonismo, que é uma teologia negativa, basicamente, é uma noção do panteísmo do Spinoza, o que é muito mais positivo. E a segunda questão é qual é a relação entre a filosofia crítica que o Schopenhauer representa em termos kantianos e o estado ontológico do panteísmo que ela queria representar na sua apresentação. E ela respondeu que ele praticamente queria falar de um panteísmo prático, que não é um panteísmo teórico, que não é um panteísmo que tem que ser filosófico com muitos conceitos, ou seja, uma pessoa não tem que ser filósofo para ser um místico que vê a essência do mundo, praticamente. Isso é mais ou menos o que ela falou.
Thank you very much. So we have one last question of Tomás, and then we pass to the other presentation. Okay. So please, Tomás.
Okay. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much for your marvelous talk. It's a pleasure to see you in Sao Paulo virtually and to listen to your lecture. I have two very short questions. First, you mentioned that there was a kind of scale of distinction than everyone else has between himself and others. You mentioned less of a distinction. Now, my question is, do you mind to elaborate on perhaps the scale behind this expression, or is there a kind of gradation? What is the maximum and what is the minimum? This could be very interesting because we are trying hard to understand what Schopenhauer says, talking about metaphysical insight of the other. Right. This is my first question, and the second question is very, very short. You know, I'm also a friend of Jakob Böhme, and I'm fond of his work, of course, needless to say. Everyone is, hopefully. But I don't really understand why you are so heavily referring to mysticism. Why don't you refer to materialism like Schopenhauer did in 1831? So he's talking about the ganglion system, which is very important and which is not the same as the brain. It's totally different. And also there are some studies about the so-called mirror neurons. Is this not a hint to another way to explain Schopenhauer's metaphysical insight without recurring to mysticism?
Mm. Thank you, Thomas. Those are really fantastic questions. On the one about, and I'll try to answer as briefly as possible because I know time is short. On the question about scales and degrees, I think absolutely. I mean, I think I see degrees of X all over Schopenhauer's thought. You know, everything seems to come in degrees, and I think this insight of moral perception also comes in degrees. And so so Schopenhauer says that, you know, in higher levels of compassion, when you get to the sort of self-sacrificing, magnanimous kind of person like Arnold von Winkelried and these kinds of characters, they see the least degree of separation between I and the other. And I think the most natural way to read that, in fact, is in terms of this axiological reading, because it does seem to be that going from the malicious person to the egoist, to the compassionate person, to the truly magnanimous, self-sacrificing person, you see basically degrees by which the other is valued. So on the malicious side, the other has like less than any value. The other is worthless. The egoist, you know, maybe doesn't see the other as worthless, but doesn't think that the other's value really is on a par with one's own value. And then in increasing levels of compassion, it seems the value of the others at a certain point, even sort of, or the value of many others kind of trumps the sorry to use that horrible word. It's Donald doesn't own that word, but
He's a friend not far away.
So that the value of the others kind of overtakes the value of the self, and thus, you know, might call for a very self-sacrificing kind of action. So I do think the axiological view does a really nice job, I think, of tracking these degrees of separation and the increasing sort of perception of the value of the other vis-a-vis the self. On the Jakob Böhme and materialism question, yeah, I think the reason why and the reason why I think I want to say that the compassionate moral insight ultimately is a pantheist one and not any kind of materialist one is I studied the list that Schopenhauer gives at the end of On the Basis of Morality very closely, and he was looking at all these kinds of monistic systems throughout time that have the same view that he's holding in the text, and notably absent are any materialist monists, right? There are tons of materialist monists out there. Lucretius, right? Epicurus, D'Holbach, Gassendi, all these folks could have been on that list, right? They're materialist monists, but none of them is on that list. And because I think ultimately the only way that he can connect that one shared essence view with the notion that that the I and the other have a similar kind of value, inherent value, is if he goes with the spiritualist monists who tend toward a more theological way of looking at the world as in fact good, divine, and that's a materialist monist in that case can't supply the value. There's just no, unless you make that one substratum something spiritual and divine, you're never going to get value out of it. That's I think what is ultimately driving his choice in that list of those who've held the one essence view.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sandra.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, professors. Bom, vou tentar de novo traduzir. Ele fez duas perguntas, né? Uma sobre a questão dos graus, né? O que pode existir dentro ali da compaixão, né? E a segunda pergunta sobre, né, por que ela não pegou o caminho do misticismo materialista, né, preferindo pegar o caminho do monismo espiritualista. Por que ela não pegou o caminho do monismo materialista, né, e sim do monismo espiritualista, né? Ela respondeu que, de fato, que ela enxerga graus, né, por todo lado na filosofia do Schopenhauer, né, e que na questão da compaixão, né, com certeza, tem pessoas que se sacrificam, né, pelo outro, o Arnold von Winckelmann, lá, que ela citou, que chega ao ponto do martírio, né, e tem pessoas, né, que adotam uma compaixão um pouco mais light, vamos falar assim, né. Enfim, né, do ponto de vista ético, tem pessoas que realmente o outro não vale nada, né, e outras pessoas que o outro já vale bastante, né. Então há uma gradação muito detalhada, né, entre esses dois extremos, e o ponto de vista axiológico, ela fala, fracassa, né, porque não dá conta dessa gradação, né. A segunda pergunta, realmente, ela fala que né, que o Jacob Boehmer, né, pode ser visto como um monista, né, com algo de materialismo, mas ela acha que o materialismo não dá conta da questão da dignidade e do valor, não, né, que realmente ela fez um estudo pormenorizado, né, sobre o fundamento da moral, e os autores que o Schopenhauer cita e os termos que ele usa, né, levam muito mais para realmente um monismo espiritual, né, que tende a ver o mundo como uma unidade, como se fosse uma espécie de Deus mesmo, uma unidade divina, né, e que isso que seria o verdadeiro fundamento, né, da ética da compaixão do Schopenhauer, né. Ok, tem mais alguma coisa, gente, que passou, que vocês gostariam de falar?
Infelizmente, precisamos encerrar. Estamos já bem atrasados.
So, Professor, it was a great pleasure to be taught by your very pertinent, original, and elegant presentation. But now we need to ask permission to you to continue with our lectures, but we invite you to deepen this dialogue at other times with us. Thank you.